Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Women in Green and Project Drawdown, hosted in partnership by USGBC-Missouri Gateway Chapter, AIA Women in Architecture, and 500 Women Scientists, St. Louis Pod, to honor the Sheroes in our community. We hope that you've had the opportunity to add comments to the chat and read fellow attendees' thoughts as we settle in for the event. My name is Abigail Sirvog, and I serve on the USGBC-Missouri Gateway Board of Directors and Education Committee. I will be moderating this evening's event. The 2020 Women in Green theme is Sheroes, which represents the female hero who excels under pressure and overcomes adversity. In this year of COVID-19, females in green industries are being asked to persevere, lead, and advocate for health and well-being in ways not previously encountered. To honor the Sheroes in our community, we bring together women who continually make a difference in green building, architecture, sustainability, and science with a panel of our own Women in Green. Each partnering organization has selected one panelist to provide insight on the female perspective of the sustainability industry and real-life examples of sustainability solutions. To provide some context, I'd like to briefly introduce you to the partners. 500 Women Scientists, St. Louis Pod, consists of self-identifying women scientists with a mission focus on impacting the STEM fields by making science open, inclusive, and accessible in the greater St. Louis area. AIA Women in Architecture provides opportunities for women in architecture to build their peer network, grow personally and professionally, and navigate the unique challenges women face in the profession. And the U.S. Green Building Council, Missouri Gateway Chapter, actively works to initiate, develop, and accelerate implementation of green building concepts, technologies, and principles that promote environmentally responsible, prosperous, and healthy places to live, work, learn, and play. The unifying theme for the Women in Green panel discussion is Paul Hawken's Project Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. In a moment, I will share a brief introduction to Project Drawdown. Then each of our panelists will have the opportunity to share some of the work they are doing that supports Project Drawdown solutions. After which, we'll engage in Q&A with our Women in Green. And now let's begin by introducing Project Drawdown. The thought leader behind Project Drawdown is Paul Hawken, who is an environmentalist, entrepreneur, author, and activist who has dedicated his life to environmental sustainability and changing the relationship between business and the environment. In 2001, he began asking experts in climate and environmental fields a question: do we know what we need to do in order to arrest and reverse global warming? He thought they could provide a shopping list, but such an inventory did not exist. All agreed that it would be a great checklist to have, though creating one was not within their individual expertise. After several years, he stopped asking because it wasn't within his expertise either. In 2013, Hawken formed Project Drawdown, with the goal being to identify, measure, and model 100 substantive solutions to determine how much we could accomplish within 3 decades. Drawdown is an atmospheric term and refers to the point in time at which greenhouse gases peak and begin to decline on a year-to-year basis. This is the point when we can begin the process of stopping further climate change and averting potentially catastrophic warming. In order for Project Drawdown to be credible, a coalition of researchers and scientists needed to be at its foundation, so the Drawdown Fellows were assembled from around the world. There are now over 70 fellows worldwide. The team gathered comprehensive lists of climate solutions and whittled them down to those that had the greatest potential to reduce emissions or sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Then literature reviews were compiled and detailed climate and financial models were devised for each solution. A diverse 120-person advisory board was created to review and validate the results. The final drawdown text was released in 2017. The solutions outlined in Project Drawdown reside in the realms of energy, agriculture, forests, industries, buildings, transportation, and more as seen here. The solutions also highlight critical social and cultural factors, such as empowering girls, reducing population growth, and changing our diets and consumption patterns. Together, these solutions not only slow climate change, but reverse it. By modeling solutions that are hands-on, well understood, and already scalable, Drawdown points to a future where we can reverse global warming and leave a better world for new generations. Shown here is an example of one Drawdown solution, Walkable Cities, where the team has outlined the solution summary, projected carbon sequestration, and projected costs for implementation. Almost all of the solutions compiled and analyzed lead to regenerative economic outcomes that create security, produce jobs, improve health, save money, facilitate mobility, eliminate hunger, prevent pollution, restore soil, clean rivers, and more. The fact that these are substantive solutions does not mean that they are all the best ones, but the majority are no-regret solutions, initiatives we would want to achieve regardless of their ultimate impact on emissions and climate, as they are practices that benefit society and the environment in multiple ways. There are three connected areas in the call for action to reach Drawdown, which we must pursue globally, simultaneously, and with determination. The first is to reduce sources, bringing emissions to zero. The second is to support sinks, uplifting nature's carbon cycle. And the third is to improve society, fostering equality for all. Nested within each area of action, there are sectors and subgroups of diverse solutions, practices and technologies that can help the world stabilize and then begin to lower greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. Together, they comprise the Drawdown framework for climate solutions. Here you can see the potential emissions impact of each sector, as well as the solution subgroups. Using two different scenarios of solution implementation, Hawkins' team derived the minimum and maximum impacts shown here. If you'd like to learn more about the project, text, or any of the outlined solutions, please visit drawdown.org. We hope that you find your own personal and professional connections to Project Drawdown solutions. Now let's hear from our panelists regarding their connections and perspectives. Our first panelist, who is representing 500 women scientists, is Dr. Victoria Herrmann. Victoria is President and Managing Director of the Arctic Institute. In addition to managing the Institute and Board of Directors, her research and writing focus on climate change, community adaptation, resilient development, and migration. Victoria has testified before the US Senate, served as the Alaska Review Editor for the 4th National Climate Assessment, contributes to The Guardian and Scientific American on climate policy, and was named one of the most 100 influential people in climate policy worldwide in 2019 by Apolitical. She has published in many peer-reviewed journals, and her expert opinion has appeared on CNN, BBC, and NPR, among others. Please welcome Victoria.
Thank you, Abigail. So when I sat down to write this presentation for tonight's event, I thought back to 2016 and 2017, when I traveled across the United States and US territories on a research and storytelling project called America's Eroding Edges. My journey took me from Alaska to American Samoa, from Mississippi to Miami, to hear, see, and experience America's climate change story. Funded by National Geographic and partnered with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, I interviewed just over 350 local leaders to better understand the effects of sea level rise, erosion, and climate impacts on America's coastal communities, and to identify what is needed to support communities in need of climate adaptation to and relocation away from extreme storms and rising tides. During that trip, I expected to find strong local leaders acting on climate. But I admit I didn't expect to find that the face of local climate champions was overwhelmingly female. Through my work, I met women leaders in every corner of this country who have dedicated their lives to safeguarding their cultures, traditions, and communities from a rapidly warming world. Now, I think I was so surprised because there's a discrepancy in how we tell America's climate change story. For most of my life, policy negotiations, expert interviews on TV news, and even marches in environmental activism were visually led by men. When women do show up in climate stories, they are often viewed as victims. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate impacts, whether it's mothers working harder to find clean water or grandmothers opening their homes to shelter extended family in the aftermath of a hurricane. But socioeconomic vulnerabilities do not equate to victimhood. Across this country, there are thousands of invisible Sheroes behind America's climate momentum. Women are strong, resilient knowledge holders, and they, I learned, were leading the transition to a sustainable, resilient future. They were already doing the work. What now needed to happen was to change the story, change the visuals, and write women leaders into our climate narrative. So I thought I would get us started by introducing a few women leaders who I met during my research and continue to work alongside today, like my friend and colleague Narelle Kay, the Communication and Outreach Coordinator of the National Marine Sanctuary in American Samoa. She is a leader in sustainable living in American Samoa, starting with what she and fellow islanders eat. Roughly a third of the world's food is never eaten, which means land and resources used, greenhouse gases emitted in producing that were unnecessary. Narelle is leading by example with interventions that can reduce loss and waste by localizing food production in American Samoa and minimizing waste as food moves from one side of the island to people's place, thereby reducing overall demand. But here in the contiguous US, my colleagues and friends, Dr. Christina Peterson and Teresa Dardar, leaders of the Lowland Center in Louisiana, are dedicated to restoring Louisiana's wetlands and empowering indigenous land management processes. Agriculture, development, and natural resources have degraded coastal wetlands, especially along the Gulf Coast here in the US. Restoring mangrove forests, wetlands, salt marshes, and seagrass beds like Christina and Teresa are doing today revives ecosystem health and promotes carbon sequestration. And even I'm part of those climate Sheroes through my current project, Rise Up to Rising Tides. After finishing my Nat Geo research project, I've continued to work with the local leaders I met across America to connect communities at risk of climate impacts with pro bono assistance in projects that adapt historic places, traditions, and cultural heritage to climate change impacts. We've connected dozens of preservationists, scientists, educators, and lawyers with community champions for skills-based volunteering through telepresence, from developing cost-benefit analysis to cultural resource management plans. Rising Tides telepresent volunteering cuts down on travel and the emissions that come with that travel, while simultaneously building local resilience. Now, Narelle, Christina, and Teresa are incredible women, but they are by no means unique. Every individual in this Zoom room has a part to play in transforming America into a climate resilient, carbon neutral country. We need local leaders and decision makers in firms, schools, and businesses to act boldly and commit to climate action. We need preservation officers and Main Street managers to inspire us with stories of the ultimate recycling, reusing historic buildings that save energy, land, and place. We need engineers and architects to lead our low energy transformation, and planners to help us reimagine more equitable, multimodal cities. We need developers to advocate for and implement carbon neutral, climate ready infrastructure, and bankers to pioneer climate finance strategies that monetarily support a resilient future. In short, we need everyone to be a climate hero. Now, I'm the first to admit that hope in climate action is hard to come by these days. With America now ready to formally pull out of the Paris Agreement next month and the drumbeat of dire scientific reports, It's hard not to feel hopeless and helpless. But I think of the hundreds of women I've met who have dedicated their careers to acting on climate, and the millions more that I will never meet who are doing everything they can to keep their communities, their countries, our planet safe. To be courageous and believe that we can make a difference to avert a climate catastrophe, we must believe that each of us has the agency to overcome our fears of climate fatalism. So as I wrap up this short presentation, I have a bit of homework for each of you. I want you to commit to act on climate change, volunteer with Rising Tides to help a community, or post your own project to have a volunteer help you. Find the courage to become a climate shero and act with compassion by working towards a more inclusive, equitable climate action table, because we need everyone to act on climate change. The cost of inaction, the cost of climate silence is far too high. And with that, I think my 5 minutes are up, so I'm going to hand it back over to Abigail.
Thanks so much, Victoria. As a reminder, if you have questions for the panelists, you may begin typing them into the chat box. We'll keep track and queue them up for the Q&A portion. Our next panelist, representing the American Institute of Architects, Women in Architecture, is Ann Lazarus. Ann is an architect and consultant at Cameron McAllister Group, adjunct faculty and sustainability program coordinator at Washington University in St. Louis. Drawing from her experience driving sustainability within an international design firm and across the architectural profession, Ann has a deep understanding of how to work with firms to integrate greater sustainability and resilience outcomes. She challenges every decision, building a community of students and instructors at Washington University, redesigning the sustainability degree program. Ann was also the founder of the Sustainable Design Initiative at HOK and served as the resident fellow for AIA National on Sustainability and Design for Health. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Abigail. And Victoria, thank you for that really wonderful presentation. It really plays well into this quote I identified from Christiana Figueres, who was the woman who really masterminded the Paris Agreement. And she has a saying she really proposes with supports, which is stubborn optimism. And I think right now we need all of us to have stubborn optimism and choose to act, as Victoria said. So I wanted to highlight two areas within the Project Drawdown that I've been active in, some for decades, some not so much. So go to the next slide. Hope. So one is bicycle infrastructure, that's in the transportation sector. I think many of us in St. Louis region are familiar with the great bike trails we have, recreational biking, you know, the Great Rivers Greenway trails like the Grant Trail or the Riverfront Trail, the Katy Trail, and even across the river, the great trails are provided in Madison County and up the River Road. But these trails tend to be for recreational use. They really don't address the dire need to have a safe way for pedestrians and bicyclists to use bikes and walking as a primary form of transportation. And in particular, if you look at these maps, it's very clear that the north-south connectors between North County, North City, into the center, and South County, South City have basically been completely neglected and is a real dire need, because many times those people who live in those places are subject to long, long bus rides to get places. There's no metro link. And so one of the things I've been involved in, if you go to the next slide, is an effort that TrailNet, which is our local nonprofit focused on creating safe places for pedestrians and bicyclists in our city. This was an effort that went on for several years. It involved, you can see 4,000 community members to really develop a master plan for a way to connect St. Louis that would be equitable, promote health, bring people together in new ways, and help local economy. So that was an effort that, because I was on the TrailNet board, I think is really important as part of this bicycle infrastructure. And then there's real progress being made. I think some of you may know Brick Line project, the Great Rivers Greenway Brick Line. There's a map on the next slide. That is the Arch to Park effort. That was a big competition, but you'll see that although the original précis for this was really an east-west, that there's a major effort here to bring north and south back connections with Grand on 14th, on 20th, and on Tower Grove. And in fact, that Tower Grove connector is underway. That's moved into the next stage. That's one area that aligns with Project Drawdown. The other I wanted to reference really quickly is something that all architects are very aware of, which is several of the drawdown solutions relate to passive solutions, things that we can do in the design of buildings that don't require a fan or a switch, that are part of the design from the very beginning, the orientation of the building, its envelope, how the roof works. So these are things that can make a substantive difference at very little cost, sometimes reduced cost. And you can see there's at least 4 of the solutions in Drawdown really refer to this design opportunity. And these relate directly to efforts that have been underway now in architecture for 12 years. Go to the next slide. Called the Architecture 2030 Challenge. This is an effort that looks at how can we have new construction carbon neutral by 2030. And you can see the white bars. The majority of the way you get to that is through energy reduction, and in many ways, passive solutions are the first thing that we try to do in architecture. The Architecture 2030 Challenge then translated into something called the AIA 2030 Commitment. If you go to the next slide, that many people I've been involved with for many years, and many of them are women. I want to point out to Victoria, the majority of the sustainable design leadership effort across the architecture profession tends to be women. And this is just an example of a series, AIA plus 2030 online series that I helped, among others, develop that would help bring the necessary tools and resources and knowledge to the architect profession so they could help meet that very important 2030 commitment. Another aspect of passive solutions, my last slide, has to do with this term passive survivability. Some of you may be familiar with this term, which really talks about how could we design and construct buildings so they maintain livable conditions in the event of extended loss of power or water. This is something that we're seeing much more, brownouts, even when they're not storm related. And it's truly created conditions. We saw that with Hurricane Katrina, we saw it with Hurricane Sandy, and in the tornadoes in our own regions, where people are without power for days at a time. And so one of the things that I've been involved in is the development of some lead pilot credits for resilience. And one of them is this passive survivability and backup power during disruptions credit that defines in lead language, how can you create a project that has to prove through documentation that will allow people, residents to survive for a number of days without power and maintain that thermal comfort, not necessarily a comfortable condition, but a livable condition. And in places like St. Louis, where we have extreme heat conditions and high humidity, and those numbers of days are going to grow substantially, even with a low emission scenario, something that addresses the design for creating livable conditions through passive solutions is really critical. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Our next panelist representing the USGBC-Missouri Gateway Chapter is Angela Moore. Angela is the Facilities and Sustainability Coordinator for the Missouri Historical Society. She is responsible for sustainable operations and programs at the Missouri Historical Society, managing 3 entities: the Missouri History Museum, the Library and Research Center, and Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. Angela gathers statistical data to analyze and gain a greater understanding of the organization's sustainable practices and its social and environmental ethics on St. Louis and on communities across America. Her most recent accomplishment with the Missouri Historical Society is a 2020 True Zero Waste Gold Certification for the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum after receiving a LEED Gold certification in 2019. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you so much, Abigail. So one of the quotes that I chose was from Mari Copeny, Little Miss Flint. And I am absolutely have been fascinated with the young activists and their movement. And so I chose this quote particularly because as women and also a woman of color, most of your perspective is not listened to within that area of building operations. And so I operate in a space where most building operators are men and not a woman of color. So I definitely appreciate that quote from Mari Copeny. So next slide. So the two areas that I work to help with Project Drawdown is through building retrofitting. So although building retrofitting comes after the building is built and after the equipment is already within the building, the key for retrofitting is efficiency, especially for historical buildings in which I operate. The one historical building that we have retrofitted is the Missouri History Museum. And so you see from the photo on the left-hand side, that building was built in 1913. And on the right-hand side is a newer version of that building. And so we know that with existing buildings, the key to that is efficiency. So two ways to achieve efficiency was building retrofitting. In the area of building retrofitting, all three of our locations, that means that retrofitting lines goes between lighting to HVAC system improvements. So as mentioned, efficiency is key because we know that 80% of the energy consumed through buildings is wasted. And so as a building operator, we have to actively work to increase those efficiency, even more so within a historical space. And the second way that I work within Project Drawdown is through building automation systems. This is actually one of my favorite areas to work in, is building automation systems. And the reason being is because it gives your site or institution an electronical brain to to automatically change settings. So although these historical sites were upgraded several times from 1913 to 2020, some of the equipment is not as efficient, but as a historical site, it's not always advantageous to take out a whole HVAC system. And so therefore, you have to make sure that HVAC system is running effectively. And one way to do that is through a building automation system. And so a building automation system takes that HVAC system out of operator mode and put it into energy efficient mode so that it is running more effectively for the building. And so building automation systems have several benefits. We have seen quite a bit of the benefits, but they minimize energy waste, which was mentioned. They reduce energy consumption by 10 to 20%. But there's also a very human element to building automation systems. They increase the well-being and productivity within that space. And so the well-being for the building operators ourselves. So our building automation system at the Missouri Historical Society and across all of our three entities controls our lighting, our cooling and heating, along with monitoring our temperature and relative humidity levels. And so our interior space requires quite a bit of managing because we preserve artifacts and cultural materials. And so once we have a building automation system that makes sure that the artifacts and cultural materials that we are collecting is at a certain interior condition level, then that's great for us. And so building automation systems are perfect for historical sites and also for historical institutions. And so thank you, Abigail.
Thank you, Angela. Our final panelist representing Crew St. Louis is Madeline Smith. Madeline is the Sustainable Development Manager at Clayco Enterprise, where she works to reduce the environmental impact of the built environment. She focuses on third-party certifications, innovative sustainable technologies, building energy analysis, and assists in internal corporate responsibility. Her most recent accomplishment at Clayco includes the LEED Gold certification of the Washington University School of Medicine BJC Mid-Campus Center, where from design to commissioning, the whole team remained focused on bringing a facility to life that would have substantial impact, not only on the health of the overall environment, but also with its occupants. Welcome, Madeline.
Thank you, Abigail. I am thrilled to be here and talk about Project Drawdown because I think that it's really going to change the industry, specifically within the built environment. And so I work for the Clayco Enterprise, so it's a fully integrated design build firm. So I've gotten to experience every aspect of the built environment, which has been really impactful. Relating back to the women component of this panel, I think that a lot of the time the opportunities are available to both genders, but we really have to push to educate and position all genders to thrive in these different positions. So that acknowledges that there are differences between men and women, and we require different, different elements to our jobs that will help us succeed. If we go to the next slide. So again, going back to the original component of Project Drawdown, I really appreciated it because it focused on things that were currently available, that were economical, and that were also scientifically valid. So they spent a lot of time researching all of these different options and the true facts behind that. And I think in our current time, we have to focus on facts and scientific evidence that points us to how we should act. So within our enterprise, we also have a self-reformed concrete subsidiary. So I've actually gotten a lot of experience with cement and concrete and the big impact it has. This was one of the things that surprised me when I first heard about it because I wasn't as educated in, first of all, how used cement and concrete are. It's very surprising that it's one of the most used materials in the world, only second to water. And it's also responsible for 5 to 6% of all human-caused carbon emissions. So there's a huge opportunity there. And I think, again, that they focused on readily available solutions. This is something that we could change today. So in understanding how this can be very impactful, you kind of have to understand how concrete and cement are made. And I did not know the difference. I didn't know all the different components that go into it. So first of all, in order to make cement, which is a component of concrete, you have to heat and break down limestone. And in that chemical reaction, you're actually producing CO2 as a waste material, basically, in order to get the clinker, which is the material that you grind in order to make cement. So when you look at just this portion, if you want to make a difference, you either have to change the components of this, which there are technologies available today. You can substitute and not use as much limestone, and that can benefit the overall carbon impact. But the other component is that in order to break down this limestone, you have to heat the materials to a very high degree, which is energy intensive. So there's actually a technology that's using just a different material than limestone, which doesn't have to be heated at as high of a temperature. And so that's allowing you to reduce the overall carbon impact. And then the second way that you can reduce this is just by using less cement in the overall concrete mixture. And so that's something that there are technologies available where they're injecting captured carbon dioxide that's been liquefied, and that will make the concrete stronger, and you can use 10% less. I think it's a little bit less than 10%. And so that in and of itself is a savings just to use less of that material. And then we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to build off of what Marianne and Angela were saying, because I think a lot of things allude to eventually getting to net zero energy. Energy is such a huge focal point of our climate dilemma. And at this point, again, it's a readily available technology that we have the materials, we have the science to really make this happen. And so it's a fundamental part of making this a priority that we really need to focus on. So when I look at net zero energy, first and foremost, the most important thing about energy in buildings is that you really have to model upfront. So at the beginning, you need to give yourself the tools to make informed decisions. And, you know, this allows you to see, is it worth my investment to look into high performance glass versus insulation versus, you know, the massing of the building. And then we can go to the next slide. And the other components that I also have gotten an opportunity to work with, because our sustainability team is housed within our commissioning team. So commissioning is such a huge component. We always focus on making sure our design is just right, but it's just as important to make sure that it was actually built as it was designed, because you can design the most efficient building, and if there are leaks in the enclosure or the MEP systems aren't operating efficiently, then you just lost all those savings. And the same kind of thought goes into the operational component, that you can design and build this very efficient building, but if you turn it over and, you know, set points are changed and all the different components aren't upheld in the proper ways, then you lose some of those savings. So, and then of course, renewable energy will always be a component. And I think that one of the reasons that net zero energy is so much more attainable these days is because renewable energy has become a lot more affordable. So solar and wind energy are viable solutions. And I think that there's going to be a huge change. Like Marianne mentioned, a lot of design firms are aiming towards AIA 2030. So I think that we're at a crucial time where we are going to see big changes in the industry. So thank you, and I will hand it back to Abigail.
All right, thank you, Madeline. We have had a handful of questions that have come in to get us started. Please keep the questions flowing via the chat box as we go through the Q&A. Our first question is for actually everyone on the panel, so we'll ask all four of you to give a response. The first question is, how are each of you cultivating the next women sustainability leaders?
I can kick us off. So I have the awesome job as an If-Then ambassador of doing exactly that. So the If-Then program is an initiative by Lyda Hill Philanthropies and AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. And there are 120 incredible women whose aim is to inspire mostly middle school students, particularly middle school girls, but also high school students to pursue careers in the sciences. And we do outreach programming throughout the year through online events and mentoring young scientists. And each of us have our own individual projects. Mine is creating a middle school magazine that's launching in January that highlights women at the poles, Arctic and Antarctic researchers, past, present, and future. And you can also catch us hopefully changing the face of science through everything from TV shows on CBS each Saturday morning, and eventually a statue exhibit in Dallas, but currently in places like Central Park and a few malls that are 120 statues of women scientists explaining what they do and how girls can get into that field. So that's one way that I am hopefully providing a lift up to other polar researchers and those interested in climate research.
can go next. That's tough to follow. Victoria is doing a lot as far as promoting women in her industry, but I am fortunate enough that our organization is on a lot of college campuses, and there's a lot of recruiting that goes on, and they talk about all different aspects of our organization, and they touch on sustainability. And so we actually have a lot of people reach out asking me, you know, what type of certifications, what type of education can they pursue that will really benefit them in coming into this environment. And to Victoria's point, a lot of the time it is females. So there's just so much interest coming from them. And also, again, I always go back to education, because I think that a lot of the time there's misinformation going on. So JUST, which is a component of ILFI, just provides a lot of facts and education about why we should be providing different opportunities to women and how we can really let them thrive. So I've been promoting JUST, and that's something we've been working on in our organization.
I'll go next, Abigail. This is a tough question. I've had the privilege of working with women of all ages in my career, beginning at HOK, where I was the firm-wide sustainable design director, and many, you know, had the opportunity to serve as a mentor for many women. There weren't that many women in leadership roles as an architect, particularly decade ago, and continue to do that and work with, you know, really important colleagues across the architectural industry in where I work with the AIA and with the USGBC. So really have created a network that, you know, we mutually support, and I've had an opportunity to mentor. But lately, my real focus has been more with my work at Washington University, where I am the program coordinator for the sustainability degree at University College, which is the evening school. So it's for adult ed. This tends to not be the young 18-year-olds, though there is an 18-year-old in the class I'm teaching this fall. But women of all ages, not just women, but men, but still, not surprisingly, the majority of the students are female. So it's wonderful to hear what you're doing, Victoria and Madeline. And I do think it's a call to action for all of us. Thanks.
And I'll finish us off. So I am someone who have come into this field from another woman that is in this field. And she oversees all of museum operations here at the Missouri Historical Society. And so learning from her and being mentored by her, I know that now I need to mentor, and another woman will learn from me. And so I was happy that I had the opportunity to welcome a sustainability intern this year. And I wanted to make sure that the opportunity was presented to a young African-American woman like myself. And so that's how I'm kind of contributing to the field. And I hope that she too learns from my example and introduce museum operations to another woman so that they can increase females within operations for museums.
Okay, thanks everyone. We have one more audience question, and this one is for Madeline because it referred to something in your last slide, but it could be for the group as well. Do you know if living walls can be installed on retrofitted buildings? The attendee saw a picture of a living wall on your last slide, Madeline.
Yes, so I think that there's a lot of components that go into a living wall. The climate you're in, whether you're looking at interior, exterior facilities, a lot of the time we actually recommend just using a moss wall because there's so much less maintenance involved, and there's a lot higher success rate. But I think that it's really on a case-by-case basis. It's definitely something that you can install after the fact, and it actually goes in at the end. So as long as you have the right infrastructure, in order to support the wall, which I would imagine you would, it is possible.
Okay. Anyone else have any other comments on that from a building experience? If not, we'll move on. Okay. Here's a question for the group. If we can get all 4 of you to answer quickly on this. Do you think the proposed solutions outlined in Project Drawdown are attainable and comprehensive for our time?
I can kick us off. I do think that they're attainable, and I think that specific to the built environment, codes are changing drastically, and that's really going to push a lot of owners and developers to pursue these opportunities. And with that increased pursuit, it's going to become more affordable. So, you know, one of the key components to the book was that they had to be attainable solutions. And so I think they did go through and vet and make sure that, is this readily available to the market? Is it economical? And so, yes, I want to believe that all of them are possible and able to be implemented today.
So let me build on that as another built environment professional. You know, yes, the short answer is yes, but I also think that it's important to recognize that the landscape is changing. I mean, as Madeline said, the cost of renewable energy is going down drastically, and that's really steamrolling, not to use a bad pun there, the change from fossil fuel and decarbonization in general. And that is, as she also pointed out, is starting to be something we're seeing in at the state level and city levels, where, for instance, in California now, new construction, you can only use electricity. You're not allowed to use any fossil fuels. So those kinds of catalysts, and it's happening across the world, I think will really make the ideas that are in Project Drawdown even potentially, you know, kind of mainstream, and we'll move on to the next level. So I absolutely think it's possible.
And now I'll add into that, and all of the solutions can come about across sectors. And so that is why I feel that it's quite comprehensive. It's just not for one sector, but it crosses all sectors and industries. And so that makes it one of the most comprehensive solutions.
So I don't want to be the Debbie Downer at the end of this answer, but I do think it is attainable, and I think that there is a lot of bottom-up and top-down work to achieve all of these solutions. However, that does not mean that climate change impacts are not going to devastate lives, communities, cultures, ecosystems, health. So while we have to give everything we have to achieving Drawdown by 2030, just 10 years, it's also, at least for me, really important to acknowledge that there is loss and damage, including lives lost from climate impacts, that we can no longer avoid, no matter how much we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And those disproportionately fall on Indigenous communities, communities of color, Black communities, low-income communities. We do not feel these impacts of climate change the same. So they're based on, you know, the racism and the systems that we have built up to create these impacts themselves from a fossil fuel reliant system. So yes, it's achievable, but it's also really important to acknowledge that we can't mitigate all of the impacts, and we need a whole lot of brainpower and money for equitable climate adaptation too.
Okay. Thanks so much for those answers. Another group question from the audience. Please share lessons learned as women in green to increase diversity across sustainability. Anyone willing to kick it off?
I'm going to kick it off. One of my lessons is not to be quiet. I had an experience. I was the only African-American panelist at a conference. And I talked about how our environmental sustainability efforts were more about supporting community efforts and lessening the negative impacts of environmental injustices within St. Louis. And one of the men that was sitting in the front row gave me a look like, well, how dare you talk about that? And so from that point on, I was like, well, that means I need to talk about it even more. And so that is what I do. I talk about it even more. And although I'm talking in the context of history museums and historical sites, I need to talk about it in the context of from a racial standpoint as well, and societal injustice. And so therefore, I continue to talk about it, and therefore that's my contribution to make sure that that topic is continuously being brought up.
So there's a corollary to your great advice, Angela, which is that when people make statements, like Angela just made a wonderful statement, that I acknowledge it and also repeat it, so that often, you know, there's, at least in my 40 years of being an architect, many, many, many examples of where a woman would say something and then it would be ignored, and then a guy would say it and we would go, great idea. So I think we're aware of that. Now that's become kind of an accepted reality. So but I think it's still incumbent on me and everyone else to acknowledge when someone has a good idea, or if it's been ignored, repeat it and say, Angela just said this, and here's my thought. So I think just constantly reminding everybody that women have a very important voice, and not to be ignored if we're going to make real progress is hugely important.
I mentioned this at the end of my quick talk to bring more seats to the table. And I think that is also a critical thing to do, is every time you sit down at a climate decision-making table, bring 5 chairs with you and make sure that they are filled with Black women, with Indigenous women, with bi women, right? Every other type of woman that you don't see at the table. And an example of this, a couple of weeks ago, I got an email to testify, to brief the Senate on Arctic issues. And I asked if there was gender balance and if there were Indigenous voices. And they said that there was not either. And I said that unless you meet those 2 qualifications, then I'm not going to brief Congress. And so they asked for recommendations, and we worked to get gender balance and 2 Indigenous leaders at the table. So every time you are asked, ask back to see who else is on the panel, who else is briefing Congress, who else is in the steering committee at your firm, and make sure that there is diversity there. Because if you don't do it, who is going to do that?
I think we're all in agreement that a lot of the time it's just about advocating for it, educating on it, educating yourself on it. And it's interesting because a lot of the time the people who are being impacted by environmental crises are not the people who are making decisions. And so I think that we really have to reach out to those communities and make sure that they understand that this isn't something that you have to deal with, and that they also have a voice. So bringing all different groups into the decision-making room.
Okay, thanks so much. Another audience question, kind of complementary to what we just talked about, but what can men in your industries do to support women sustainability champions? Anyone want to start us off?
I can just keep going. So I think that right now there are a lot of men who feel like they're not sure. Everything's wrong in our society right now. You can't do anything right. Like, a lot of people feel like anything you say is going to offend someone in some capacity. So I think just being honest and open to, you know, being educated and being open to different ideas than what you're used to can actually be really beneficial. Because I think a lot of people immediately go on the defense, and instead of necessarily being defensive, we all could, you know, learn from different people's perspectives. So I think being open to different ideas is first and foremost, but also I think that, you know, I kind of go back to my original statement that we have to provide environments where all genders can thrive. So women are going to have children a lot of the time. Women are going to have some sort of responsibility that's different than men. So allowing them to process that and then regroup and get back to work is really important.
I would suggest to do your research. So I don't know what field you're in, and I don't know what the 54 participants who are on this call's fields are, but every field has some type of women initiative. Figure out what that is in your field and cold email them and ask how you can be supportive, right? For my field, I know that there are women in Arctic and Antarctic sciences. I know that there is Plan A, Women and Gender in the Arctic. Emailing them and asking, what can I do? How can I get involved? They'll know how you can be supportive. Yes, absolutely. Educate yourself, create space, bring those 5 chairs to your table and make sure they are filled with a diverse set of strong women leaders, but also reach out and see what other women need in your field. Because as an Arctic scientist, I don't know what architects need, but I'm sure that the Sustainable Women Architecture groups do. So Google it and see what they say when you cold email them. I'm sure there are 20 tasks that they would be really thankful for somebody else to take on.
So I want to build a little bit on that, Victoria, your statement, because I think, you know, that men have sort of, particularly white men, a position of power, and they can use that power to help promote the identification of BIPOC people, of women, for positions, and insist that when an opening in a firm or whatever, that there be candidates that aren't the same as them, and their voice will be heard. And so I think that's really an opportunity that men can take advantage of in this situation.
And I'll just say, look within your own biases. So take ownership within your own biases, because those are usually what come out in your behavior. And so that is the one thing I think men can do to help women across industries, is take ownership of your biases and try to turn those around so that they can benefit everyone across the organization.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's go to one more audience question. So for the St. Louis ladies on the call, what programs and actions are you partaking in to help with drawdown solutions in North St. Louis? And then complementary to that, what program can educators and aspiring Sheroes get behind?
I'm gonna go with that one. So although I have a passion for gardening, I decided to become a master gardener. And I did that because there was a call for African-American women to work within the YMCA gardens within North County, North St. Louis. And so that's one of the initiatives that I started. Was I became a master gardener so that I can learn how to increase food sources within those areas. And so that's just one of the ways that I work within areas across St. Louis, but particularly within North City and North County.
The organization that I'm representing tonight is CREW, which is Commercial Real Estate Women. And I think that just connecting with other women in the St. Louis area can really help make connections. You always find out different backgrounds that people have that might be related to sustainability. And I also think that as a sustainability advocate, we shouldn't just be looking for people who are interested in sustainability, but looking for groups that we could, educate and help kind of direct them towards ways that we could be thinking about things differently.
So I am not in the St. Louis area. I am a Jersey girl, but am based in Washington, D.C. at the moment. But I am going to plug the organization that I am representing, 500 Women Scientists, and the St. Louis pod that does some awesome community outreach work. There are lots of ways to get involved in advocacy and policy work around supporting science-based decision-making and STEM education. So I would suggest you check out their website that I shared in the chat.
So I already mentioned the work with TrailNet, which really is trying to connect North City through safe bike access. But I also have the privilege to serve on the Building Energy Review Board, which is a new board that's been created to oversee the implementation of the Building Energy Performance Standard that is going to define a set of requirements for existing buildings to meet in their energy efficiency over the next several decades. So that will affect all of the city. And certainly could benefit everyone in North City as well as throughout the city. So that's a board that I'm just starting in.
Okay, thanks so much. Victoria, let's go to you for a specific question. You talked about hope in your presentation, but there's a lot of hopelessness around climate news and reporting right now. How can we find hope in climate action today?
Yeah, that I think is the biggest question that I get, particularly when I do work with middle school students, is, why should we be hopeful? And I try to replace being hopeful with being courageous and finding the courage to act. And part of that is because hope is a future-oriented emotion, right? We can feel hopeless about something today, but hopeful about the future. It's a lot of the stories we tell of a better and brighter future. It's why we act today. If we feel hopeless about the future, we are not going to invest our time and energy into that, right? When you see a coastal community in the US being a victim of climate change where there is no hope, you're not going to invest your expertise as an engineer or an architect. You're not going to invest your political clout or your finances in helping that community. If you see them as courageous and see hope as a future-oriented emotion, then the narrative starts to shift and you say that this is worthwhile, that they have a vision, they're vulnerable, but they're not victims. So I think how to find hope is to find courage, to look around and see all of the visions that communities across this country, from cities to remote and rural villages, already have for a low carbon future. They just don't quite have the technical expertise or the financial resources to get to their own vision. And see yourself in that story, right? That's pretty hopeful that everyone has a part to play in America's climate story and you just have to find yours. There's lots of visions. There's lots of community champions out there. All we need is courage from everyone on this call to find their place in action. And then the future looks a lot more hopeful than looking at the scientific reports that I drown in every day.
Thanks so much for that great insight. This could be either St. Louis related or more nationwide. Do you see the Black Lives Matter movement and the Drawdown movement overlapping? And then how?
I think we kind of touched on this before, but I certainly think that there's an overlap. We really are in need of some real change, especially in the United States. And I think that people have gotten accustomed to ignoring these huge problems, but we can't really ignore them anymore when there are wildfires going on. There's these extreme weather events that are impacting communities that are costing our country billions of dollars. And also it's encouraging to see that there have been so many protests and people really calling to action about, everything related to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think that with all of this need for change, I think that they'll build off of one another in their momentum.
I have a different take on that. So I don't necessarily see an overlap there. I see a lot of different relations, and they're similar because we are talking about the well-being of African Americans, people of color, from different standpoints. One from an environmental standpoint, but then one from a standpoint of systemic racism within other contexts. So I don't necessarily, me personally, don't necessarily see it overlapping. I do see that they do talk about the impact that it has on African American lives. But Project Drawdown, I just don't see how it is interwoven with the Black Lives Matter movement. But that's just my personal opinion.
Well, I do think that, and Victoria has already stated this very eloquently, that there's obviously people of color are more negatively impacted by climate. It's happening now, and it will certainly happen in the future, no matter what we do. And so it's more to me about addressing through the response to make sure that in addressing mitigation and adaptation, that we take into account trying to overcome the systemic racism that's created the conditions we have now that are so inequitable. So they come together in that, to me. Drawdown has a sort of health and economy factor in its set of solutions that partly gets to that about equity. And I do think that when we talk about what we need to do, there's no silos, that we have to look at these things as integrative.
And I would just add that, in both Black Lives Matter and in climate action, the leaders of that are, Black women, are Black leaders. You think about environmental justice as a movement, much of which climate activism is based on today. That was founded by Black mothers. It was founded by Black scientists like Robert Boulard, right? That thinking about the leaders of advocacy movements and how they translate into policy action from a climate activist standpoint, right? I'm a scientist, but I'm also an advocate that goes out and protests. And a lot of that is built on the foundation of environmental justice as a movement, and that advocacy frameworks and, thought processes for how you build community change are similar. And that's something that is talked about from bottom up to top down change. So do they overlap? From an advocacy standpoint, there's a lot of learning that goes on in between, because both are, raised out of community advocacy tactics.
Okay, thanks so much. Another audience question. So we have some students and some young emerging professionals on the call tonight. So they have asked, what is the most important advice you have for emerging women professionals interested in this field, particularly in this unique time of COVID? Also for those who are in school or who have just graduated.
Well, maybe I can start this off, because I do have a academic, adjunct role, because I get this question and people say, I want to be a sustainability professional. And I say, there is no such thing as sustainability professional. You're always you bring sustainability to whatever you're doing. And, in my case, I'm an architect. Angela's in the facilities, Madeline's at Clayco, Victoria's a scientist. We all have sustainability, I'm going to assume, at a core value. And so to young professionals, emerging professionals, students, I say, follow your passion, and you can bring that sustainability lens, and in my case, a climate action, imperative to whatever you're doing. you know, in the insurance industry, in banking, law, there's always a way to make something happen. And you have to, you know, to be, if you are privileged enough to choose what you do and have a role in that decision making, you know, then go with what you want to do, where you feel you can be most effective, and bring sustainability to that.
And to build off of that, I think that's a really important thing, that, again, we need to not just focus on finding sustainable consultants or companies that are focused on sustainability. That's what I did when I first graduated. I felt like I needed to work for a consulting company or someone that specializes in sustainability, but really everyone needs a sustainability advocate these days, especially in larger corporations. There are opportunities everywhere. Specifically within the built environment, I know that there are certain third-party certifications like LEED and WELL, Living Building Challenge. You can get accredited in those different standards, and that's something that you can do during COVID, lots of study time. But that just shows that you have an interest in that, and that you have a basic understanding of the key fundamentals. And then a lot of what you do, you learn on the job. I think people want to be super prepared and learn everything before, but kind of the best part of having a job is that you get to learn new things and kind of evolve into your role.
Sorry, I was just going to echo Angela's comment earlier about finding a woman mentor. I wouldn't be where I am today without having my first job at a think tank in DC, having a strong female mentor. Shinpei Tsei is why I am where I am today, because she showed me a pathway to grow as a sustainability professional, and she advocated for me. When you're looking for jobs, when you're looking for internships, think about who is there. Think about the women that have inspired you and cold email them. The worst that can happen is they don't email you back. The best that can happen is that you have a lifelong advocate and a new friend. So email the women that inspire you and make sure that you connect with them and see what their pathway was. And COVID's a good time to do that, because all it takes now is an email and hopping on a Zoom call, and you can do that with anyone across the world. And the other thing that I would say is, it is a hard economy right now. That's just something that we need to acknowledge. As a professor, it's hard for me to tell my students where to look for jobs because they are sparse. So an alternative is to think about applying for small grants to pursue your own capacity building projects, research projects, technical projects. I got my start with a National Geographic grant, and I'm very thankful that they continue to support my research, but that was an early career grant that I applied to while I was still in school. So I would say look for grant opportunities if the job market is really hard. And I will share my email, and I'm happy to help any early career folks and students find grants that are right for them to apply to.
Okay, thank you so much.
And then I also will say, follow your heart in what you really want to do. Just like Madeline and Marianne and Victoria mentioned, you can take sustainability into any field. My initial passion was the arts and to be in a museum, but I never thought that I would be in sustainability in a museum. But when I brought sustainability into a space that welcomed it, they nurtured it and allowed me to continue to grow. And so take a risk and go with your heart and take sustainability with you. And if you do that, I guarantee you the right organization will carve out a place for you to build sustainability within that organization.
Okay, thank you so much for the very insightful responses. One more group discussion question, and we might have time for a couple more questions left. Can you outline an experience of working in green as a woman that really made you feel that you were in a field that clearly needed more representation?
I'll continue. I think when I saw that picture of myself pictured with all other white men as a museum operator. And I knew from that moment when I saw that picture that that was pivotal, that I needed to make sure that I build on having more women in the field and having representation of women in the field. So I think that was my one moment when I was serving on that panel, and it was just me as the only woman panel. And when I saw that picture, I knew I have to personally mentor and build on more women coming into the sustainability field.
So working in DC and working in the Arctic climate change world, I intersect pretty often with the military world because that's who dominates the polls. And not the first, but the seventh time that I was mistaken for an intern rather than being referred to as Dr. Herrmann at an all-white male table discussing Arctic affairs. I realized that I had to stop showing up until they met demands of, pulling up those 5 other chairs. And so I've committed to doing that since that realization that I'm not an intern anymore, and that people should probably recognize that. And the way to do that is to make sure that you're not the only younger woman in the room of mostly older white men.
So this is I've been an architect for 40 years. So I think all the architects in this group recognize how few women have been in that profession as a percentage. And the good news is, and I'm really proud to represent today the AIA Women in Architecture St. Louis group, which has created a really wonderful network of women supporting each other, sharing their knowledge, visiting each other's offices, and bringing much needed information about how to be successful women in the architectural profession, which I did not get at all. And I so appreciate the work that's being done by the leaders who are providing that now to our profession, not just here, but across the architecture profession at large. There's a major focus on diversity and addressing gender, racial, sexual orientation in our field. So I'm much more hopeful, using Victoria's word, that there's some courageous people out there that are just calling the shots, and really happy to see that.
And I had a similar experience to Victoria, being in the construction industry. It's a male-dominated industry. And one time I was going on site and somebody asked me if I was lost. And I've also been asked if I was a student. And, they're not malicious questions, but I think it's just important that women make a point to get on construction sites and prove that there's no difference. And also just being confident. I make a point to walk around a construction site like I know what I'm doing. And I think that can only benefit just as more people see those, the diversity specifically within the construction industry, it will only gain traction.
Okay, great. We have time for one more quick question. So this would be maybe a 1 or 2 sentence answer for everyone on the panel. But which section of the book from Project Drawdown really resonated with you, and why? So if we've talked a lot about solutions tonight, but if there was a surprising one or something that really resonated with you, we'd love to hear that.
I know the one that really resonated with me was education of women. I think that it's often overlooked, and it is such a key component. Again, it's like the more you educate people just in general, but specifically with women when they're traditionally put into a homemaking role and taken out of the workplace and where decisions are made, it makes sense, and it's just not something you think of. So I was really happy to see that was in the book.
Madeline, me and you had the same thought process. That was the section that I really enjoyed, which was the health and education, and particularly of women and children. And I just love the logic and the scientific data behind it. And that was a section of the book I truly enjoyed. Because usually when you're in the sustainability field, there's all the technical data and the energy, but having that human element within there, that really was just the most profound portion for me.
So the addition to that, Angela, is the reproductive health, focus on reproductive health, give women the choice when they should, if they should have children. And that was the other piece. It was the education of girls and the reproductive health that really popped out as like, whoa, I hadn't thought about the climate impact of those decisions, but they were very in the top 10.
Yeah, I think for me, the land and coastal ecosystem management was the highlight of the book, and to return and empower Indigenous land management, because it does double the work. It mitigates as carbon sequestration, and it adapts to more extreme storms, longer fire seasons. And I work alongside many Indigenous experts and knowledge holders, and that seeing it alongside the technical expertise made me realize that publications don't do that nearly enough. And like having sustainability in every field and not it being the name on your tag, we should also probably have Indigenous management across all of these different solutions, and not just in the sinks section, which is what resonated with me.
Okay, thank you so much. We are almost out of time, but that was a great insight from all of you. Thank you again. And as we come to a close, I wanted to call out an opportunity to support and learn from additional women in green. There's a new book titled All We Can Save, which illuminates the expertise and insights of dozens of diverse women leading on climate in the United States. Scientists, journalists, farmers, lawyers, teachers, activists, innovators, wonks, and designers across generations, geographies, and race, and aims to advance a more representative, nuanced, and solution-oriented public conversation on the climate crisis. If you're interested in picking up this book, please support your local bookstore. On behalf of all the event partners, we would like to thank everyone for attending, and thank our Sheroes, Victoria, Marianne, Angela, and Madeline for participating in a great discussion, and for the transformational work each of you is engaged in. We look forward to working together in the future to continue elevating our community and this work at large. And we hope to see you at an upcoming event. 500 Women Scientists next pod meeting is on November 11th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. And the USGBC-Missouri Gateway Chapter is hosting a Benchmarking 101 session on October 21st and a coffee break on October 30th. Check out each organization's website or your preferred social media platform for more details. Thank you all for being here tonight, and have a great evening.